Coming up on the Point and Click podcast, we're going to talk to a cybersecurity expert about what you can do to protect your personal data online. Jonathan Steele from Steel Fortress joins us next.
This is the Point and Click podcast with your host, Mark Yapchak.
I'm very happy to have with me on the Point and Click podcast, Jonathan Steele. Jonathan is one of the country's top family law attorneys and cybersecurity and digital privacy experts. He is the founder of Steel Fortress Cybersecurity Consulting, helping businesses safeguard their sensitive information and intellectual property from cybersecurity threats. Jonathan is going to give us some information and tips on how we can protect our data online in an ever-changing digital world. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me and offering your expertise and knowledge to our listeners.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So tell me a little bit about your background. How did you move from the field of family law into cybersecurity? It doesn't seem like maybe that's a natural transition, but how did that happen and what motivated you?
Yeah, born and raised in Chicago. I've been doing divorce law in one form or another, including clerking, since I was 16. So it's been a long road thus far. Somewhere along the way, maybe with the onset of COVID, I pursued a more in-depth understanding and education as it related to both cybersecurity and privacy to fill, time at home, and just I had an interest in it to begin with, so it allowed some time to do that.
Well, that's great. And so maybe moving in from the law field into cybersecurity, you probably had a lot of need to get access to data and information as part of your research and, setting up your cases, so to speak. But, as we transition, the conversation really is going to be about how people can protect themselves from maybe people that are the bad actors trying to get access, not necessarily lawyers, but people that might have, nefarious intention. What are actually the most common mistakes that people make when it comes to protecting their data online? What are they doing wrong?
What you read in the listicles in the news feeds they're true. People are using bad passwords. They're not using two-factor authentication. They're using the same password everywhere. They're not using password managers. All of that's true. But there's some nuance to it, and the threat landscape, so to speak, is changing with the advent of artificial intelligence. Phishing emails that used to be pretty easy to spot are much more difficult now, and phishing is one of the most prevalent forms of cyber attack. So I think people aren't doing a good job of training themselves, and maybe employers could do a better job of training their employees how to spot phishing emails and what to do about them if they do.
It's interesting. Literally today, I got a phone call from somebody trying to get me to call a number, an 800 number. They used my father's name and says this information is for my father. Now they're calling my telephone number. Obviously, I'm not my dad. And they're saying, you need to call this number. We have, legal action we're going to be taking against you. Now, how likely is it somebody going to be calling a number out of the blue and saying we're going to be taking legal action against you without any, certified letter coming to your address saying, here, this information is coming. You better be prepared for it. Something like that. It seems like, well, you're instantly like on defense, and you suddenly lose all of that rational thinking and constructive thinking. What are people to do? Are they to be distrustful at the very beginning of those kind of engagements?
Yeah, yes is the short answer. The longer answer I would give you is that people are they're buying this information. That this is coming from data brokers. That's why. Your dad is being referenced in a voicemail. That's how they're coming up with your contact information. So trying to remove that data from as many data brokers as possible is a particularly worthwhile endeavor. To your point about how often are lawyers calling up the people they're going to sue and telling them in advance, almost never. I've never heard of anyone doing that. I think it would put you at a disadvantage because you then need to serve the person with notice, and you've made it harder by telling them it's coming. So normally those phone calls about, this is the final notice before we take legal action and we're going to sue your social security number, those can be disregarded. But I understand that as a lawyer, I more easily disregard them than somebody that doesn't have that training. And so they can be jarring. It can cause stress, and then you start to worry and you dig in a rabbit hole trying to find out why is your social being sued? Can it even be sued? And things like that.
Well, you mentioned data harvesting. I know there are a multitude of sites out there. I did a little exercise. I have a friend who is a private investigator, actually, and I said, "Geez, just out of curiosity, could you, use whatever tools you use for your investigative research, and put my name in there and just let me know what's out there?" And what he came back with was, I mean, I was actually shaken to the core. They had a photo of my house. They had all of my prior addresses. They had all of my family members. In most cases, they had all phone numbers that were associated, even numbers I thought were unlisted, they had access to. So what is a person to do if that data is out there? How can you rein it back in?
It's hard. You can't put toothpaste back in the tube. The problem is you can remove your information from some of the big ones like Spokio, Radaris, White Pages, and that goes a long way. It's a manual process unless you pay for a service to do it for you, and there's a new data broker that pops up daily, if not two. So it's hard. It's a game of whack-a-mole. And part of the problem is sometimes you will successfully remove your personal information from Spokio or Radaris, whatever it may be, and then they will re-scrape that information from another data broker and then just relist it. So unless you're able to whack all of the moles simultaneously and preemptively know when they're going to pop up, it's hard. You do the best you can, and you try to remove it from at least the big ones so that it's not just a simple Google search away.
Now, we talk about, the most basic technology, basic steps to protect our personal information, things like you mentioned earlier, creating unique and strong passwords. How effective is that, and what should people be doing when they're creating those passwords? I mean, if that's the first step in the process to protecting your data online, whether it be the data we just mentioned, how important is that, and what can they do to make it better?
It's as important as it can be. Passwords are, we're doing away with them, but that process is going to be very, very slow before we fully adopt things like passkeys. And so they're here to stay for the foreseeable future, and they need to be strong. And part of the reason is that you want to use a password manager is that it's able to generate a more random phrase than you give yourself credit for when you say, well, it's my dog's name and a random number at the end and an @ symbol. A script that's just running through dictionary terms is going to guess that password in seconds. And so you want either a unique passphrase where it's a few words strung together with some capitals and some numbers and some symbols, or you want just completely random. And the reason that you want a unique password for every service and site is there are leaks, there are hacks, there are breaches. And so once, if you use the same password at Netflix and Verizon, and Netflix leaks your password, then somebody might have access to your Verizon account because they will use something called credential stuffing, where they just try all these passwords and usernames that have been part of public breaches. So you need a unique password, you need a strong password, and you need to store them somewhere that's convenient. Otherwise, you won't use them. So password manager is very little friction, and it makes all the difference.
Does it help to have, I know a lot of sites are starting to use two-factor identification, two-factor authentication, rather. Is that a step in the right direction, in your opinion, for protecting that information?
Absolutely. That comes in different flavors. So it's a nuanced answer. There's SMS two-factor authentication where you get text message codes. There's authenticator apps. There's physical hardware tokens. There's passkeys that are loosely defined as multi-factor authentication. And they escalate in terms of how much protection they're going to offer you, with SMS being the worst because you're susceptible to a SIM swap attack. But if you have something like a YubiKey, a hardware security key, and it's actually required, and there's no backup where you can use SMS as a backup if you lost your key or something like that, you've buttoned up that account about as tight as it can get, because without that physical token, it doesn't matter if you have the password, you're not getting in.
Yeah, I worked for Time Warner for 30 years, and they had a key fob that had a generator on it, and it would generate a number. And anytime we would log into the company network, we'd have to look at the current number at that point, type the number in to get in. I mean, it was changing constantly. And I think not every user, not every consumer is going to have access to that level of protection. So In your opinion, does taking advantage of two-factor identification, if you're given the option, is that the way to go?
Almost always. I can't think of a scenario where it's not. Where you hear it, the pushback is the friction, that it's annoying, it's time consuming, I don't have to do it. But you got to think long term and think, how much longer of a process is it to clean up afterwards when you're hacked? And it's a huge time drain, and it's a money drain, and it's an energy and a stress. So a couple seconds added to your workflow for two-factor authentication is always worth it.
I wanted to kind of move in a little bit in areas that people are probably very lax in their attention to detail of protecting their data. One of the areas that I think is very important is social media platforms. I mean, we are nowadays as connected as we've ever been. I mean, there are people with multiple different social media accounts, sharing information. The old adage, don't tell people you're going on vacation on social media, because the bad actors that have access to it say, okay, all we've got to do, like you mentioned, is scrape for that information, and now we have the address. We know where they live. They're on vacation. Easy target. How important is it for people to be conscientious about protecting what they provide or supply online?
It's very important. Whatever you put out there, it's out there. Again, with the toothpaste in the tube, if you've posted a picture on social media, you're not getting it back. You might delete it from Instagram, but it's out there. Somebody, a Wayback Machine, harvesting of the web page, good luck getting it back. So you need to be conscientious of what you're posting, when you're posting it. If you want to post pictures from your family vacation, and I can't dissuade you against posting pictures of your kids, okay, fine, go ahead and post them, but post them in a batch when you get home. Don't post them live, because to your point, you're just telling somebody that's watching your posts that your home is empty. And so I think it's very important from a physical safety perspective. I think it's important from a data privacy perspective, because if you're putting it on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all these places, you may have your account private, but that term is being loosely defined when it comes to Instagram and Facebook. So, it's important to just be mindful of what you're putting on these platforms and make sure it's something that you're comfortable with everyone knowing about you and everyone seeing about you.
Well, that's great advice. And I think, speaking of social media platforms, I mean, you see everybody with their phones and they're online constantly. One of the areas that I thought was interesting maybe to delve into is maybe the risk of being in public spaces. I know that a lot of companies, a lot of businesses offer free Wi-Fi, and people may be doing business-related work. I know there might be issues regarding that. Companies might have policies regarding doing anything of sensitive nature in a Wi-Fi space, in a public space. But how can someone protect themselves if maybe they choose to use that area?
A few things. One, you can join your phone as a hotspot. That's going to be a pretty secure option. If for whatever reason you can't do that, you don't have service, you don't have a hotspot plan on your cell phone, whatever the case may be, then you can join that Wi-Fi. The reality is nowadays most web traffic, if not all web traffic, has that little padlock in the address bar. It's HTTPS, it's encrypted, and it's fine. The old adage about public Wi-Fi and the dangers there's still some truth to it, but if you're using HTTPS websites, your traffic is encrypted and it's mostly okay. One thing you can do to give yourself a little more peace of mind is to use a VPN that you trust, because then the traffic between you and the VPN server is encrypted, and so whether the Wi-Fi is secure or not, it doesn't really matter. Something that I've started doing recently, I bought what's called a travel router. It was less than $100 from Amazon, and I will bring that along with me, and that will join a public Wi-Fi, and then I will join that. And so it keeps a separation between me and the Wi-Fi, and it also, it connects to VPN automatically, so my traffic's encrypted within it, and that's really giving me some peace of mind and knowing I'm pretty protected even on Wi-Fi that is questionable.
So, I mean, that's the same situation as maybe setting up a home Wi-Fi network. I mean, I know there are options within routers to set up firewalls. Do you think firewalls are a good first step as far as protecting maybe that if you're taking the online situation from the public space back into the home space? Is that an important effort to set up a Wi-Fi firewall?
It is. Having a firewall on your home network is important. Having a firewall on all of your individual devices is important. And having good firewall rules on those devices is also important. An improperly configured firewall or a firewall where you've opened ports and you forgot about that you did that, you left them open, can be problematic. And also, people that use the Wi-Fi router combo packs from their ISP, those might not be so good versus some more robust, particularly focused firewall options. So it's a gradient of an answer, but it does help.
Now, we've talked a lot about what the risks are. I mean, all right, say the worst situation does come to pass and somebody realizes that their personal data has been compromised in some way. They see maybe their data up on some service somewhere. What steps should they take if they realize, oh my God, I've been, like I said, hacked, or my information is out there? What can they do?
Stopping the bleed as best you can, because you can't get it back. You can harden your operational security as best you can. You can put a freeze on your credit report to prevent any credit cards from being opened in your name or loans being opened. Maybe you subscribe to credit monitoring, although I view that as being more reactive than proactive. And if you can afford it, great. Maybe you harden any existing accounts, change passwords if you think that the passwords may have been compromised. And just keep an eye on everything and watch your bank accounts and watch as much as you can. Setting up a fraud alert in addition to your credit freeze can be helpful. Some recorder of deeds in certain counties allow you to put up an alert if there's a recording on the PIN of your home. That's helpful. And then just being hyper vigilant about the phone calls and the emails that are going to start pouring in now that your information has been leaked.
You mentioned, we talked about encryption, we talked about VPNs. Are there any tools other than that somebody could maybe implement on their computers to add another layer of security, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think, depending on what your operating system is, Apple and Mac does a pretty good job of malware prevention by itself. Windows Defender has come a long way, but there are more robust options as far as antivirus goes, because a lot of them are signature based. And what that means, the way that you used to detect viruses is you've seen it before and you see it again, and so it raises an alarm. Nowadays, it's more sophisticated than that. Nowadays, you're not really using traditional viruses and worms in a computer network. You're more often seeing zero-day phishing links, things like that. And the more advanced firewall options are going to be able to detect that better than sort of the more basic ones.
Now, we talked about, social media, being online and Wi-Fi, but something that I think people might overlook in their day-to-day lives is how connected their homes are. I know in my home, I have smart speakers. I have internet-connected devices, whether they be light switches, light bulbs, security cameras. You've heard the stories about, a kid's monitor camera and somebody talking to the child through the camera because somebody had really lacked security. How concerned should we be, and what should we be doing to kind of lock those internet-connected devices down so that we're not being subjected to potential cyber threats?
I try not to be an alarmist, but a healthy dose of concern is warranted here for a multitude of reasons. For one, a lot of these IoT devices are not well maintained. They're not updated. They're not patched. And so there may be a vulnerability in them. And that's just an open door to your network and to your personal devices. Beyond that, there are certain devices where you don't really know about their calls home, whether they're reaching back out to their manufacturer, what kind of information they're sending to the manufacturer. And there are things you can do to prevent that. When I became a little bit more privacy focused than I was pre-COVID, I did a number of things that I think people could do that's relatively easy. I got rid of all my Amazon Alexas. Those at some point creeped me out that they were listening and recording all the time. The same with Hey Siri. I turned that off because it was listening and recording and sending it to Apple all the time. And I got rid of a bunch of Nest cameras because those were listening and recording and sending everything to Google all the time. And pick your variety. There's Ring, there's Nest. Those are all convenient plug and play options, but they're not very private. And so you could set up your own home surveillance system where it's not calling home or it's not sending your information to anybody. You can set up DNS level filtering at your home, like something called Pi-hole. That's a free open source project where it blocks devices on your home network from doing certain things that you don't want them to be doing, from contacting services you don't want them to be contacting. So it's like a security and layers approach, and there are things you can do that are easy today and no friction, and then just sort of build on it from there to keep those devices protected as best you can.
So in your opinion, if somebody chooses to use those devices in their home, is there anything they can do to make those devices more secure, or is it kind of you're leaving it up to the corporations that have provided you those devices to be the ones to monitor it?
You can put them on their own Wi-Fi network. A lot of even consumer-grade Wi-Fi systems allow you to create a guest network in addition to your home network. And maybe you put your Nest thermostat and your cameras and things like that on the guest network, and then your personal devices, your cell phone, your computers, your iPads, all of that on its own network. So then there's some isolation, there's some segregation, and so devices that are on the guest network are all isolated from each other, and they're also isolated from your own devices. So I think that can be helpful.
Right. We talked about that, the social or the connectivity that the homes have. A lot of people are moving into cloud storage as an option for storing a multitude of things, whether it be something as innocent as your family photos, your music collection. But more and more people are using it to store, personal information. What are the risks of using cloud storage, cloud services? Are they secure in your opinion? Are there things that we should be careful of doing when we use them? Should we avoid them? What do you think?
In most, if not all cases, cloud storage is encrypted at rest, so that's good. And it's encrypted in transit, so that's also good. But where the lines there are is that with the majority of cloud storage, it's not just you that has the keys to that encryption. If you're using Google Drive, if you're using iCloud storage, Dropbox, they have the decryption keys in addition to you. And so, depending on whether you are storing something that you don't want there to be any chance of someone at Google or whoever looking at, there's a better option, which is an end-to-end encrypted platform like Proton Drive or Tresorit, or I think Synology has an offering that does something similar. All of those are going to be a little bit more privacy respecting, but from a security perspective, they are all going to be encrypted at rest. And so that is helpful in and of itself. The problem that people just overlook is that maybe Google does intend to look at your data, maybe they don't. But the ability to do it is concerning, because sometimes these companies are hacked and they leak data. And if that data is not encrypted by you, then it's vulnerable. And then there's the risk of a nefarious employee at Google or somebody looking at your stuff. So I would push people towards end-to-end encryption. There's almost no reason to avoid it. Even iCloud now allows you to have end-to-end encryption on the majority of their services, with like calendar and mail carved out. But you have to flip a toggle somewhere in your settings for advanced data protection, and then you have that protection. So I think cloud storage can be helpful. It can be a good backup strategy, but it's important to either use end-to-end encrypted platforms, or if you're stuck on Google Drive and I can't convince you otherwise, then I would look at something like Veracrypt, which is free and open source software where you encrypt something in a container on your end, and you can then upload the encrypted container. So it doesn't matter if Google has the ability to look at it, because it's nothing but garbled text. And there's a number of other options that allow you to do that. There's Cryptomator. That's a pretty easy to use app as well. And they all have that in common, where they're just encrypting your data before you're even sending it anywhere.
Well, I want to kind of maybe put, I know we talk from the cybersecurity perspective, but how important is it for people to read the fine print? I know a lot of times I would just click OK to just about anything that comes up on any software or service that I get, and maybe that's not the right approach. I mean, is there value to, digging into the legalese, so to speak, and reading all of that information? Is it really going to make a difference if you choose to use the service anyway?
Most of those agreements that you're talking about, the terms of service for apps
Right.
and software, those are what's known as a contract of adhesion. You're not changing them. You're not negotiating them. You're just clicking accept because either you accept it or you don't use the product. That's not to say that there's not some value in understanding the terms and what these companies can and do with your data. I read them. It's part of the training, but I also just want to know what you're able to see, what you're doing with it, who you're selling my information to, and why. Without delving a little bit into some of the fine print, you're making decisions blind. And if you had a little bit more information, maybe you would use these services differently if you knew what exactly they were doing with your information.
On that being said, let's give the listeners maybe just one last bit of information or suggest some advice for how they can monitor their footprint going forward and ensuring that their personal data is not being misused. What should we be doing as a matter of just a regular routine when it comes to that information?
What you had a private investigator do can be valuable. Doing a little bit of open source intelligence gathering on yourself gives you a good sense of what your footprint is and what can be cleaned up and what can't. Trying to employ some disinformation strategies can also be helpful. And that's a whole can of worms in and of itself. You can start to use email aliases and a private mailbox somewhere you don't live and tying utilities and things to that so that that's what's populating in data broker sites is your address. You can start using phone number aliases and things like that to just try to make yourself a harder to profile target because you're making those phishing phone calls all the more difficult if there's just a lack of sort of a central point of truth about all the information about you. So at any given time, I think at this point, I have over 900 email aliases. I probably have 15 phone numbers. I use a private mailbox. And so if you're trying to gather information, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's hard because it's hard to tie all those different identities together. And so, it's making the best of a bad situation. It's compartmentalizing so that damage is mitigated if something bad happens. The email aliasing strategy has other benefits where, if I'm getting an email to an email alias that I set up for Bank of America, then I know it's probably Bank of America that's emailing me. If I get a Bank of America email to any other email alias, I'm going to be pretty suspect that it's Bank of America because I know that's not the address that I gave to them. And I can turn off aliases when they get leaked. I can turn them off if I start to get spammed. It also gives you the knowledge of who's selling your information. I created a Royal Caribbean alias for a cruise, and now I'm getting emails from all sorts of companies to Royal Caribbean at whatever my domain is, and I know it's because they sold the alias. How else would any of these companies have it? So it gives you that power as well. And it's a pain to set that up. Maybe do it going forward as opposed to doing all the old accounts, but as compartmentalizing can be a particularly helpful strategy, I think.
Well, it takes a little bit of effort, a little bit of homework. And, I know a term that's bandied about a lot is zero trust. I mean, do you feel that a good measure of skepticism and, protecting your information and zero trust is a good policy to enforce personally?
I employ it anywhere I can. The motto of it is trust nothing, verify everything. And, the old systems that we use to, connect to our office, like a VPN, it works. It's reasonably secure. It's reasonably performant. But it's sort of like a floodgate. Either you have access or you don't. With zero trust, it's much more granular. You can say employees have access to this specific server on the network at this specific port at this specific time from these specific devices in the specific device health. And so you can be really granular about the access that you're giving. And you can apply sort of that mindset of zero trust everywhere. If you use a personal computer or a Linux machine, you can use non-privileged user accounts so that if your account is hacked, it's not really able to do global damage to your computer. You can give your kids and spouses limited access to certain things, not because you think they'll abuse it, but because maybe their device gets hacked and it becomes a vehicle to bad traffic. So I do think it's important, and I think it's important to apply the principles of it outside of the context of something that's just traditional zero trust network.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you very much. This has been a very informative and enlightening conversation. There's a few things that I'm going to do once we're offline here, maybe to start moving in that direction. I'd love to have you back on again in the future if something a topic comes up that I think your expertise would fit. But again, I appreciate your time, your expertise, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to thank Jonathan again for joining us on the podcast. Now, don't forget, you can catch upcoming episodes on your favorite podcasting service. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Audible. And you can connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and watch videos of the podcast on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.